Welcome to the CNBC Africa special on doing business in Gauteng. I'm Nozipho Mbanjwa. Now, Gauteng is the economic and industrial hub of South Africa and the African continent. And like most of the world, the province is not immune to the adverse effects of the slowing global economy. What can be done to encourage business growth in Gauteng? Joining me to discuss this topic, as well as looking at the cost of doing business in the province, incentives for doing business in Gauteng, as well as the province's commitment to cut red tape, I'm joined by Jeff Nemeth. He is the president and the CEO of Ford Motor Company South Africa. Saki Zamxaka, the CEO of the Gauteng Growth and Development Agency. Rui Marto, executive for the South African Portugal Chamber of Commerce, as well as Khoza, the spokesperson for the Gauteng Office of the Department of Corporate Governance and Traditional Affairs, as well as Human Settlements. Gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome. Now, as we've stated in the intro, the political and economic environment at a global level has changed. Some have even said that we're hurtling into a new era. The question then becomes, what are the opportunities and perhaps even immediate challenges that this poses for businesses based in Gauteng? And Jeff, I'll start off with you. Where do you see opportunity and where do you see some stumbling blocks?
Well, certainly our geographic location close to Africa and the billion potential customers that there are on the continent is a great opportunity. The infrastructure that South Africa has gives it an advantage over some of the other countries, even within the continent, as well as the advantage geographically to some of the other potential trading partners. But I also see a vibrant economy. I see workers that are our workers are very highly productive. They're also able to pick up the nuances of African consumers.
Right.
So we can meet the market better from here with our South African staff than any other country.
So lots of positives from a geography, infrastructure. You're positive on the economy. You're positive on the talent pool that we have in South Africa as well as in the province. Are there any things that are currently and most likely going to keep you up awake at night, given these changes at a global level?
Well, at a global level, there's a lot of whitewater. There's things going on like Brexit, the referendum in Italy. I think the people are still watching what's going to happen in the United States after the recent election. So there's a lot on the horizon that's maybe a little bit unknown. But I think what we do see in South Africa is a very stable economy. The growth isn't spectacular, but It is stable. The rand has stabilized. So a lot of the impacts to business have really become something that we can almost predict.
Right.
And that's really what you're looking for.
So more predictability, and that's a key theme that you're putting on the table. Saki, again, an opportunity for you to really begin to extrapolate for us. Where are the biggest opportunities for the province, but also what is keeping you and your team awake at night as you try and build scenarios for this new world that's emerging?
Thanks, Nozipho. I think generally in the world, one of the things that's been big about economies is either concept of an inclusive economy or dealing with the real economy where the jobs are. Because part of what we've seen in the world is everybody saying, we see this growth, we hear analysts talking about bond yields and everything else. What does it mean for me? Are my incomes increasing? Am I getting a job or am I getting laid off? So really our focus in the economy is what can we do in the real sectors of the economy, manufacturing, where people can be employed. So the work we do with Ford through the Automotive Industry Development Center is to encourage those sectors of the economy that actually produce something. We're looking at trade promotion, South African companies selling things outside of the country. It's another market which we can look at as we expand our production. But again, you want as South Africa grows for the rest of the continent to grow. So also encourage South African companies to invest in the rest of the continent. It creates new markets for us and creates new things that we can do. So there's a lot of that. Another area we also think is important is encouraging a bit of risk capital so that the smaller parts of the economy and have a potential to add more jobs and more services and maybe other businesses which we didn't have. So that's another area that needs to be encouraged. So really our focus is what can we do to have an economy that doesn't grow just in theory, but grows in the sectors that matter the most.
So a huge emphasis on the real economy, on the potential around new markets, but of course on risk capital, which is going to be needed to unlock additional capital into the economy. And we'll come back to a lot of those issues. Roy, let's get your big issues put on the table as well. The opportunities that you're seeing, and of course bringing in a very strong European perspective to the conversation, but also what keeps you awake at night?
I think I'd rather not share that. Nozipho, thank you. I think, from barriers to business, I think the European Union Chamber, of which the South African Portuguese Chamber is part, did a survey which was published last year. And I think the principal main issues in terms of barriers still include around certain legislation. So that includes both the BE legislation as well as the labour legislation, labour unrest and labour issues. The other aspect was, of course, crime and corruption, still a big point, and further issue tends to be around kind of the acquisition and retention of skilled labour,
right,
as well. However, globally, what I can confirm, and I think the viewers would like to know, is that there's a huge interest still, mass interest in terms of people wanting to come in, and European companies wanting to come and do business in South Africa. It's a question of just trying to work out a better climate in terms of for that to happen. Business, I think, globally is about trying to cut through the red tape and trying to facilitate businesses as much as possible.
So lots of hot issues that you've put on the table, from labour unrest, legislation, as well as crime and corruption, and of course the influx of skilled labour. Keith, again, an opportunity for you to bring your voice into this conversation and putting on the table the opportunities and the challenges.
Well, government is a big economic player. Government spends in excess of $1 trillion every year in the economy. So government does contribute to the economy. However, what concerns us the most is the cost of doing business and the time that it takes for us to facilitate business as government. And that's why, as government, we have now prioritized in Gauteng the issue of cutting red tape to facilitate a quick turnaround in terms of servicing those that are in the economy, and as well as our clients, which is the public. So we attach value to time. Time is money. And the more we can reduce the cost of waiting and getting people to get into business, it augurs well for the economy. So our priority is then to look at the mechanics of how government can facilitate things to happen and happen faster, quicker, much to the appreciation of business in terms of them getting into business as soon as possible. The more we delay, there's a cost attached to their jobs, turnaround time, and so on. So it is a priority where the Premier of Gauteng has said to MEC Mashatile, lead this team of MECs, look at solutions, how we can cut red tape and ensure that business grows and thrives in Gauteng. So that's our priority.
And of course, none of the issues that we've put on the table here today are new. We've been talking about cutting red tape. We've been talking about creating jobs. We've been talking about reducing the cost of doing business. And given the fact that we are almost in a reflective part of the year, I think it might add value just to begin to record big or small wins that we have seen in the province in the last year, maybe 2 years, before we start talking about, well, what can we do differently and what can we do next? So I'm going to start off with you, Keith, because you spoke very frankly around the need to reduce red tape. What has been done tangibly and practically where we can say this is what the government has done for business in the last 24 months?
Well, in the last 2 months, we have visited at least no less than 3 countries to look at the best models and the best practice in terms of cutting red tape. We're looking at countries that reduce, if you want to get into business, how long would it take you in South Africa to apply in CPRO, get approvals. If you want to build, if you want to come into the built environment, how long does it take you to get EIA approvals and so on? Business people with monies that want to go into business are kept waiting until government slow wheels come to that decision, and that's a cost of jobs and profits for those that want to invest in the economy. Now, we have moved away from just talking about it to acting. We want to come up with actual practical protocols that are going to govern government doing business with the public and the economic sector.
Do we have targets in place where we can say, as the province, we're looking at a target that's for starting a business in Gauteng, that this can be done in 36 hours or this can be done in 48 hours? What is the tangible target that we're all working towards?
Well, we've got a panel that we have set in place that is now processing the information that we have. We started where it matters the most. What hits business most with people that we're doing business with as government? How often do we pay people? You know, so that people don't suffer the problem of cash flow, because even if you have money, but if you don't have cash at hand, you can shut your business down. We can shut your business down. We are not committed to 30 days, but the Premier is emphasizing that we move to 15 days. When a person submits an invoice, it should take no longer than 15 days to process that invoice, pay people so that the businesses continue to operate.
And of course, when we talk about cash flow, a huge issues for small and medium-sized enterprises that do business with the state. And 15 days, we'll get to compare with what the global standard is and really get a sense of whether this is an indicator that is really moving in the right direction. But before I get to the businesses at the table, Saki, I want to bring you in here as well. What we are hearing from Keith is one of the big indicators is the number of days or hours it takes you to start a business. But the cost and ease of doing business is also broader. Are you able to record for us and share with us big and small wins that are tangible and practical that the GGDA can point to?
No, thanks, Nozipho. A couple of things. First, we have what we call the Gauteng Investment Center. It's here in Sentin, 1 Sentin Drive. The two gentlemen next to me know it. We host them there a lot with the business chambers. But what it's meant to do is to bring all key services into starting a business.
Yeah.
So environment impact assessments, if you need one, you can go there. The commitment currently by the Department of Environment Affairs is that it will not take more than 90 days, but the plan is to reduce it to 30 days. So what we're targeting is to have it done in 30 days. Municipal approvals, we also monitor them that they are done within reasonable time, maybe less than 30 days if we can achieve that. What Keith has mentioned, payments in the family of the businesses under economic development, the standard is 15 days that everybody gets measured on, but agencies have now moved to being measured on paying within 5 days.
Right.
We've not made it official yet because we want to see what the implications are going to be, but we're cutting the time that it takes to do such things. So those are some of the things that we're doing. The motor industry is one of the very big examples of what South Africa has done, not just Gauteng, in supporting the motor industry. We now have Ford doing the Ranger in South Africa. Part of it was a collaboration between government and the Ford plant in motivating to have that investment, and it runs into billions of rands. So there are certain things we've done. We've done outside missions to the rest of the continent and the rest of the world, where we took business that wants to export certain commodities from South Africa. Financial services is interested in investing in infrastructure in the continent, energy, water, and we've had those businesses going to East Africa, Kenya and Rwanda.
Right.
We've had other parts of the world where, I mean, Namibia, there was an investment conference which we participated in, because one of the areas we're also looking at is mining equipment to the rest of the continent. So you can go on in the different sectors where they're starting to be practical things that we've done.
So I'm going to turn to the businessman and ask the big question, is this enough? Is this changing your experience of doing business in South Africa, and is it reflecting on your bottom line? And I'm going to start off with you, Roy. We've heard the wins that have been bagged, but does this shift the needle for businesses in the province, and is it enough to attract other European business to come to South Africa?
Look, I think the job of the Gauteng Investment Centre has been fantastic. So the facilities are fantastic. The staff, the collaboration, and the ease with which, or they've certainly facilitated businesses in terms of investing in the province. But unfortunately, not enough is done outside of the Gauteng Investment Centre, in my opinion. And I think the breakdown is not so much in terms of the decision making or the policies. I think we have very good policies in place. I think when we look at economic plans, and especially the development plans in the province, it's good quality work, fantastic ideas. The biggest issue, in my view, is the implementation. The implementation, one doesn't necessarily see it trickling down to a practical point of view. And I think the person that sits at the other side of the counter in terms of assisting business, the message doesn't get across to them. You know, it's almost as if they don't get how important it is in terms of investment coming into the country.
Is it a training breakdown? Is this where where you think the disconnect comes from? If we've got fantastic policies, why are they not reflecting fantastic work on the ground?
I think it's a combination of factors. It could be part training, but there seems to just be an indifference regarding, you know, investors coming in. There seems to be a more focus in terms of the country itself, and not enough importance given to their task and how it fits into the bigger picture relating to easing a business. I mean, it's frustrating. I was probably going to say something I shouldn't. When you know, a business stops coming into the country for a permit, right, or for something that, in the greater scheme of things, is negligible, because someone doesn't necessarily get it in the bigger picture what it is that they are preventing or stopping from happening.
So both Keith and Saki, I'll give you an opportunity to respond to that, because it is going to be an issue if a company turns away at the border because of a permit, and that foreign direct investment then it cannot be accounted for in South Africa. But Jeff, you've heard the quick wins that have been listed, and some of them are long-term wins that have already been registered. Is this reason enough to see more American companies coming into the Gauteng province? How do we strengthen the case for doing business here?
Well, I think one of the big wins this year, and Roy mentioned it kind of more in a little bit of a negative term, which is labor. Certainly in the automotive industry, this year we had our once every 3 years labor negotiation, and it was the first time since 2007 we completed that negotiation with no work stoppage. Then subsequent to that, our supply base had a negotiation, and they also concluded their negotiation with no work stoppage, which was the first time in about 10 years.
Do you know what the secret sauce is this time around, the thing that was done differently that wasn't done 3 years ago? I
think what happened this time, you know, it's hard to put your finger on one little thing, but you know, the Deputy President, Mr. Khoza, had a labor indaba late last year. I think it was in November, where he brought the business and the union, NUMSA, our union happens to be NUMSA, together. And we had an indaba for a couple days, talked about everything, why it was important for business, and speed is of the essence, and why it was important for us not to have a work stoppage. And at the same time, labor talked about the needs of their union members and the social and economic challenges that they have. And when we started formulating maybe a space where we could meet well before we started the negotiations.
So labor is certainly one of the things that you're saying is a win that is working for you. Is the labor variable the most important for a player like Ford? Or are there other variables that you think that both government and the various agencies of government, like the GGDA, should be focused on to make the business environment more attractive?
Yeah, one of the things certainly for South Africa, given its location, being its geographic dislocation from where most of the world's economy is, logistics are a huge piece of our business here. We export 60-65% of what we make to mostly to Europe and to countries far away, and about 30% of our raw materials and parts come from those same countries that are far away. And so the speed in getting things through the ports, the reliability of Transnet and their ability, both Portnet and Transnet, to get materials to us here in Gauteng, both faster and more efficiently, is a significant piece of our business, a much larger piece of our cost base than it is in a country that's closer to its customers. So that's one of the things that I think we need to do more. I think the government needs to help find a space between state-owned enterprises and private business that recognize the needs of both.
So Keith, I'm going to allow you to respond to some of the requests, let's put them that have been made by business. And Saki, I'm going to come to you as well. But let's address the issue that Roy put on the table first, the disconnect between policy and the exercise of that policy, or the translation of that policy into practical support for business on the ground. Do you agree, firstly, that there's a disconnect?
Well, in some instances, there is a disconnect. And one of the things that you hear often is that South Africa has good policies. The challenge is the implementation, which means people that should be implementing those policies either are inadequately trained or don't have the right mind to do what is expected to be done, which is a challenge that we need to address as government. How do we bridge that distance between good policies and good practice? And with what we have started in Gauteng of looking at the best practice is to try and identify the mechanics of constructing that bridge. What is it that needs to be done for us to be able to merge the two? Look at our good policies and the good implementation of those policies, march to the achievement of the goals that we have set. But the other issue that is important as well is that maybe with agencies like GGDA is to also play an advocacy role. Some of the things that business would expect are national competencies. As a province, we can't readily address those issues. They're beyond us. But in partnership with business that operates in Gauteng, would be in a position to play an advocacy role in saying, please pay attention to these issues. These issues need to be addressed for the following reasons: to make our economy more attractive for investment, and actually to ensure that those that have invested here have no regrets in having done so.
Saki, I suspect that you want to pick up on a lot of these, but also if you could address the issue around seeing an integration or alignment in understanding between the economic infrastructure that's required, logistics support being one of those, the role that state-owned enterprises can play in that regard, and of course just ensuring that the basic economic support is there, energy, access to water, just to ensure that businesses are running at an optimal and efficient rate.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Nozipho. I think, firstly, broadly, the comments are correct, because if South Africa doesn't achieve growth rates of 5%, it tells us that the economy is not performing at the levels it should be for it to create the employment we need and reduce poverty in the country. So really, there's a lot that needs to be done in the economy. But for me, the point is, we've demonstrated in the past year and 2 years that with targeted focus in certain areas, you can yield the results. So if you look at the Gauteng Investment Center, which was launched in 2014, just one example, the Portuguese. 5 years ago, there was very little investment from Portugal into South Africa. Currently, it runs into billions. A lot of it facilitated through that center. Because what it has done is that it brings even the competencies Keith is talking about that we don't have in the province. The DTI works with us, Revenue Services works with us, Home Affairs work with us. So if you have issues with a permit, you now can deal with the investment center without having to figure out, I must go to a municipal office here, I must go to Pretoria, I must go everywhere. So you have now one point of call, which makes things a little bit easier for people who want to do business. So we do, I mean, one classic example now, we're working with the mining capital equipment manufacturers, those who do capital equipment but also consumables. So we meet with them and they raise a very simple thing. We exporting palms into Canada, but we having problems of SABS standards. They're not accepted in Canada. So every time we put in a pump, it has to be tested. It costs us money, but it takes time. There are even other components we can supply. But because this is an issue, it's impacting on doing business. So we brought the industry with the DTI. We're going to meet with the Canadian Embassy, have an MOU on how we resolve this standards issue. So we hope before the end of the year that problem would be resolved. So again, a lot of the things, it's either the time it takes, the fact that you have to figure out where to go, and we're bringing those things to one space where people can come and we help them.
The harmonization of standards, I think, is a really insightful piece that you put on the table. So before we get to break, let's add the layer of the right incentives and how incentives are positioned so that they make business sense for potential investors. What is the new thinking that's emerging around this?
For me, Nozipho, the real incentive to do business should be that companies see South Africa as a growing economy, a growing market where they can make money and get a better return. So in theory, what should really attract a Ford to come here is that there is a market that's South Africa, there is a SADC market, there is a sub-Saharan market. Incentives and ease of doing business must be secondary. It must be facilitating where people believe that this is the market they want to be in, because incentives, how long is a piece of string? How much more can you incentivize a business to come in? Business people won't come to South Africa because you offer them zero tax. Yes, it's a good thing, but first, is there a market for what I want to sell? So really what we're saying is that if you look at South Africa, Gauteng has more than 13 million people of the 50-odd million people we have in South Africa. The incomes are higher here than anywhere else. Logistics, yes, becomes an issue, because if you're here, you also 2 hours to Cape Town, you 2 hours to Namibia, 4 hours to Kenya, 4 hours to Rwanda. So Gauteng is fairly central to some of the neighboring countries. We speak the same languages in certain instances. English, yes, there's also Portuguese, but it's easy to be in Joburg and deal with the rest of the continent. But whether it is the standards, whether it is tax regimes, whether it is Transnet on the costs to move vehicles, and we engage with these departments and say, if we are to be competitive as a country and as a province, we've got to have the cost inputs at levels that are reasonable and competitive internationally.
Well, on that note, I don't think I could have taken us to break in any other better way. We're going to take 2 minutes, and when we come back, we're going to touch on an earlier point that was raised, and this is how to ensure that we can unlock risk capital so that more commercial capital can begin to flow in the province. And of course, we're also going to be looking at the support for entrepreneurs as well as the revitalization of the township economy in the province. Our live audience is standing. Welcome back. If you've just joined us, our conversation is focused on doing business in the Gauteng province. We're looking at issues such as cutting the red tape. We're looking at issues around incentives and, of course, reducing the cost and ease of doing business in the province. My guests who have joined me at the top of the show and are still with me, I'm joined by Jeff Nemeth, President and CEO of Ford Motor Company South Africa, Saki Zamxaka, the CEO of the Gauteng Growth and Development Agency, Rui Marto, Executive for the South African Portugal Chamber of Commerce, as well as Khoza, spokesperson for the Gauteng Office of the Department of Corporate Governance and Traditional Affairs and Human Settlements. Welcome back, gentlemen. Now, some of the topics that we still have to tackle in this conversation. Very early on in the discussion, Saki, you raised the need for us to look at risk capital. I'm going to throw it at you first, Keith, and maybe just get a sense of what are the new innovative ways that we're looking at funding entrepreneurs, funding small and medium-sized enterprises, and unlocking risk capital that make it easier for other investors to get on board?
Well, raising capital has been an ongoing exercise in government. We've got a number of agencies that are trying to assist what we call development finance agencies, which are government entities that try to assist in terms of raising capital. But that has also been complemented by private sector funds that have mushroomed recently to look at specific sectors of the economy. the issue has always been accessing those funds. That is a challenge. Because if you look at who is in the mainstream economy vis-a-vis those that are in the informal settlement, the township economies, the constant challenge they are facing is accessing capital and the availability of capital. Do they have the requirements to access capital, things like surety and so on? They don't have assets, and so we need to be quite innovative in creating an environment where people can access capital, and the requirements that come with that as a collateral is mitigated to a certain extent by some of our agencies in terms of meeting the inadequacies or the deficit of asset requirement to complement or as a way of using it against that to access capital. So government is preoccupied in that. And we have now seen the consolidation of some of the government agencies. As opposed to having disparate agencies spread across, we are seeing now the convergence of some of them so that they have a bigger purse to tap on to provide that capital, but also working in partnership with the private sector.
So as an extension of that insight, Saki, I mean, one would always argue that you need to de-risk entrepreneurs, you need to de-risk players who are in the township. Is that the right way of problem solving around this issue of access to risk capital?
Our approach, Nozipho, is that part of the challenge about access to finance is actually structural, and until you deal with that structure, it's always going to be an issue. So the simple thing in lending or even in investing, you've got to price for the risk. You price it in different ways. If you believe that in venture capital 3 out of 10 are going to succeed, it means you must be willing to lose 70%, which then means you must believe the return you're going to get on equity is more than what you're going to lose. Or if you're in the interest rate environment, somebody must either have security for that. If there's no security, you must allocate capital for it. So government has to respond to it in different ways. The first one are the development finance institutions, which by nature are supposed to play and fill that market failure and that gap. We believe that we could be doing more, even with the funds available in the development finance institutions. We're seeing a bit of them being a little bit more aggressive than they've been previously in lending money or investing in startups like the ITCs and all of that. But the reality is that government on its own is never going to have enough money to provide capital in every sector of the economy. Part of government's role is then making the environment to work. And part of the conversations we're now having with the CEO's initiative is that they've identified an SME fund, and really what that SME fund is in reality is a venture capital fund, which pushes the boundaries a bit. But big thing still is risk. Who takes the first loss? And we're trying to convince government that to encourage more investment by the private sector, government must put in R1 for every rand the private sector puts in certain funds, and be willing to take on more risk than the private sector does. But of course, government must make sure there's oversight, there's no recklessness, but two, that it does things that are developmental and good for the economy. So those are the conversations we're having in the province to say, what can we do to allow risk capital from the private sector, not just rely on government. But as you say, the big thing is how do you de-risk.
And Jeff, for those entrepreneurs who do get access to capital and are running businesses, are you hearing a good business case for the collaboration between established business like yourself as well as entrepreneurs that make part of the very important local economy that should be benefiting from the broader manufacturing activity that we would see from the likes of Ford?
Right. Well, when this whole conversation started about 5 or 6 years ago, we said, boy, we'd really like to be part of finding a solution for SMEs, job growth. But we're really good at building rangers, and we're not really good at starting up SMEs. So we partnered with Saki and in his organization, and we came up with a model an incubation model that, because the biggest sources of risk are, one, customers. Do you have customers? Two, does your product meet the requirements? And three, do you have the financing? And do your people have the training?
Right.
So what we said is we can handle 3 out of those 4, right? We're the customer, so we can buy this. We can buy the parts. We can teach the people how to make the parts, and we can ensure that they have a partner that can help with that as well. But what we can't do is we can't give them a place to do it and the funding that they need. And so we partnered with the AIDC, which is part of the GGDA, and we came up with a model, and we actually have a list of a building that's full of entrepreneurs, and most of them from the Mamelodi area, that now are supplying our plant right across the parking lot, and we partnered with the government in order to make that happen.
So there certainly are models that are working and that can be extrapolated and scaled for other parts of the country. But Roy, before we move on to the audience, one of the things that we'll hear from the GGDA as well as other government agencies as well, we need to revitalize this township economy. What would it take for European businesses to go and do business in the township and not just the urban centers of the province?
Well, I think that, again, it's a question of ease of business. I think it's a lifting of those restrictions that we've spoken about. But certainly, I think business from anywhere in the world, looking in terms of a new market, I think it doesn't need much in terms of being motivated to exploring new markets. And I think it's a question of infrastructure which needs to be in place, and the readiness to do business overall in terms of partnerships. And I think that also solves to a large extent the funding aspects as well.
So Saki, before I go to the audience, and I know I've said this, so I'm really going to go to the audience now, but infrastructure surely must form part of the list of the quick implementables that need to be in place for this township economy to begin to be revitalized. But can you just share with us some of the thinking around how we're getting capital inflow into the townships?
Well, I think there are generally 2 things, and this is where the collaboration with the different spheres of government comes in. A lot of the infrastructure investment or infrastructure required is not something we actively do as a province. So water would be a big thing, electricity would be a big thing, roads would be a big thing, and we work with the different spheres of government to say, can we, as we attract investors to come here, guarantee them security of supply of energy, security of supply of water, and other inputs that they require. I think, though, despite the challenges we have, as South Africa, we're still at a point where some of the basic requirements can be met. We have capability in townships and other parts of the country that's still fairly underutilized. If you go to the East Rand, there's a lot of factories that have access to electricity and water and have been decommissioned because there's no market. And we've then taken a view that to revive them, we must look for new markets for them. Again, the capital equipment manufacturers in a similar model are saying, government, you're spending a lot of money on infrastructure. Can you make sure that a portion of that money is spent on South African businesses that produces things here? So it's money we're going to spend anyway.
Right.
We're not saying be protectionist in your approach, but we're just saying, can you make sure a percentage of that is actually sourced from companies that manufacture in South Africa? So there are certain small things like that you can do to influence behavior and where people go. If there's an incentive for anybody to make money in Soweto, they will go to Soweto. They don't really need anybody to tell them. But if they believe they're not going to find skills, if they believe there's not going to be electricity or there's no consumers, then they may not go. So you show them where there is a market, because again, government spends certain things, so you can use government spending to influence where you think certain sectors of the economy can grow.
So certainly front and center is articulating the business case well, so that business wants to get into the township. But of course, there's always the legacy of poor service delivery in those areas, and that needs to be contended with as well. Now, we have a live audience with us who have their own questions and the comments that they would like to bring to the conversation, and we're going to turn into that session now, and I'm going to ask our guests to please stand so that they may be able to ask their questions. First question, please, sir. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Mashego Maleka. I represent a company called Zenzele Technology Incubator. November 2014, the Premier announced match funding in support of township economy. How far is that? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mashele. Very direct question there. Let's get the second question, please. Sir, if you may please kindly stand and direct your question.
Good afternoon. Steve Jordan from AdReach, a out-of-home advertising company. I want to pick up on something that I think most of the panel members have touched on. I think that Jeff kind of highlighted quite strongly in his last comment, and that is the one of partnerships between business and between local government and also between provisional government. We've been very fortunate to have been part of a public-private partnership with the local government here and as well as with the Gauteng government for the last 18 years. And it is something that's worked exceptionally well because it leads to understanding of each other's needs, and through that we can work a lot closer in terms of developing SMEs, in terms of developing government's needs, local government needs, and businesses' needs. It gives you that opportunity. And public-private partnerships and partnerships have been something that have been spoken about quite a lot. And I just feel there should be a lot more energy in that area, because to me that is one of the, no solution is easy, but it's one of the best solutions in order for us to grow together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let's take the third question before we come back to the panelists. Yes, please, sir.
Hi, Ian Huntley of the Manufacturing Accelerator Program. And I think your panelists will have to share the answers. We look at trying to rebuild manufacturing, and as you know, manufacturing is key to any economy regrowth. And what we see is the biggest issue is the market, the offtake. So Saki, you mentioned the capital equipment guys, the tooling guys, we partnership, but they complain that the state-owned companies, the municipalities, etc., are not giving the fair share of offtake. And that is a fundamental, with the 3 trillion odd that the country is spending over the next 10 years on infrastructure, that would secure an awful lot of jobs. So I'd be really keen between Keith, yourself, and maybe even Jeff, because the model the automotive industry has used, we've used successfully, not only in South Africa, but in other countries, Canada, Benelux, etc.
Ian, thank you very much. And we'll come back to the audience for further questions. But perhaps let's start off with the offtake agreements, because this is a fundamental part of completing the circle if we're going to talk about public-private partnerships that do work. Saki, let's get your input on that, and then we will rotate it around.
Look, I mean, the concept of partnerships, I think that's where the thing starts. What are the expectations of us as South Africans, the communities, the ordinary taxpayer, the private sector, and government, because we've operated on a regime that says when government spends money, there must be value for money. So yes, you want localization, you want BE, but what reigns supreme 90% is functionality and price. So if somebody produces or sells something to government and they can sell it cheaper, but they get it from outside of the country, are you going to promote your local industry at the expense of what may be seen as competitiveness? And again, those kinds of decisions need society to agree on what makes sense. And from our perspective, what makes sense is that we create certain jobs here. We don't want, yes, to price in lack of competitiveness, but there should be a measure of saying, well, if we're spending 3 trillion, maybe 1 trillion, we must guarantee that it is from people who actually manufacture in South Africa. So we're seeing it happening in certain sectors where I think even regulation by government is now being changed, where you can enforce a little bit more stronger what the localization is going to be. Otherwise, you then run into people saying, well, why did you buy from X business when the thing can come from somewhere else much cheaper? Because some of the people are South African businesses, even though they import, and they will say, well, I can do the same thing for government at a cheaper price. Why did you give it to company X, which is a bit more expensive? But as I'm saying, we're starting to see rationality that says you can't have a country that spends money in a manner that kills its own industries. So those offtakes are going to happen in some of these commitments by government. Here in the province, there's an 18% target of township-based companies. We know there are many other targets as well on women-owned companies, companies owned by people with disabilities. We've also seen in the big government programs where they say 65% local content, where we know we may not have certain technologies inside the country. So there are things government can do, but I think we all have to agree and know what the consequences of that are going to be. And I think to some of the more direct questions, the other one I think relates to the Premier's program, which was called SEPO 500,000. It is running, may not as yet have picked up in terms of private sector investment as much, but the Gauteng City Region Academy is actually running a lot of those initiatives. So there is youth training that is being done, and all government departments are being looked into it. But if there was a specific application the gentleman had made to the province, we can look into it and see what has happened. But the commitment is still there.
So problem solving in the moment, I love that. But Keith, I want us to continue with this theme of public-private partnerships, because I think it extends to both questions, and I'll bring Roy and Jeff into that conversation as well. And the insight from Saki is that we need to balance some of the requirements we want to support local entrepreneurs and the local economy with off-take agreements that make sense, which relates to the question that came from Ian. And what we also heard was that PPPs have worked and really well in certain sectors. And we're almost moving into a world now where there are new voices saying, should we be rethinking public-private partnerships? And that's only because they haven't worked in other areas. What is the position of government in terms of PPPs and using project finance to unlock opportunity?
Well, PPPs as a concept is brilliant. PPPs in operation, these are what people view as an onerous process from the point of conception to a point where it's implemented, because of the various stages it has to go through for approvals and so on. Because, you know, when you deal with government, you're dealing with a different kind of creature. Before you commit government money, there has to be all these compliance issues you deal with, which is something that Treasury at some point would need to address, to say, while we appreciate that, how do we fast track those agreements? PPPs, and it should dovetail to what Saki was saying in terms of your offtake agreements. When we talk about offtake agreements, it's not offtake agreements in relation to government work only, government as a consumer. It is also about offtake in relation to the private sector. When we encourage SMMEs and other small players to come into the mainstream and play a role, who are the off-takers?
Yeah.
We have to convince the private sector that they have a role as well, particularly the domestic players in the economy, to say, here are new players that are coming into the mix. How do you help them come up and to mainstream what they are doing as service providers? You know, as government, certainly we're looking at targets. How do we encourage government to give preference to new initiatives in the economy? But there has been a reluctance in the private sector, and the argument has always been the bottom line. We agree with the bottom line. We want business to succeed. But what does it mean in a long term if we cultivate local capacity to provide solutions for all consumers across the board, business, government, and everybody? The Ford experience is paying off. How do we replicate that to other sectors of the economy, so that you have new young players who understand the need to sell at an affordable price for the consumer, and also to allow you to stay in business and grow? You know, and what are the standards, quantities, and plans? How do we support them? Through incubation efforts, we're trying to instill that thinking and push them and nudge. But until there is an even appreciation across from between government and the private sector, we'll see the landscape changing.
So the trigger word there, resilience. And so I'm going to get the private sector to respond to that. And Keith's very clear that we're not against the bottom line. I think those were his words. But how do we begin to get the buy-in and the appreciation for local economy development? Jeff, let me get your take on, and of course the broader theme is the public-private partnership model. And then Roy, I'll get your view as well.
Yeah, well, I think I just want to emphasize one of Keith's points, and that was compliance. In the model that we had, that I spoke of earlier, the rules around the government investing in private industry, as well as our rules, corporate rules with partnering with government, took a long time. They had to bend, we had to bend within our compliance framework, and we need to figure out a way to do that more quickly. The other thing that I would like to say as well is what we do is we identify a need, and then we figure out who's the best to address that need. Tool rooms were brought up, or tooling was brought up. There's no tool rooms in South Africa. So even if the tools are made here, whether we make them overseas or make them here, we use them, and after a year they need to be refurbished. And there's a great shortage of artisans, and there's almost artists to fix those tools. And so we partnered with the government for a tooling training program so that we could create the capacity to open tool rooms, and some of our suppliers then were able to put tool rooms on site that were a partnership between the GGDA and the Department of Education and ourselves to form to meet that need.
So certainly an opportunity also being fleshed out in that insight that you're sharing. And Roy, your views on the resilience and what would inform that resilience?
I think businesses certainly wanting to invest and certainly start new projects need to be extremely patient. I think the frustration, especially at the SMEs level, is dealing with certain organizations, whether it's from DTI, IDC, etc. Each one has their own requirements. Banking has its own requirement. They all have different levels of risk. And I think that sometimes if you're looking for those partnerships, when the partners themselves have different requirements, then it sometimes becomes almost impossible to meet both standards. And my greatest frustration is, I'm a commercial attorney in practice, and I walk the road with a lot of those SMEs dealing with these departments. And the reason for my grey hair, I'm actually 20-something, has been dealing with the experiences. And the thing is that both whites and black South Africans complain at the moment. No one's getting money at this stage. It's just very, very slow, very cumbersome, and we deal with something that I referred to earlier, a lot of indifference. The people that you meet, they really couldn't care less, that's how it's perceived, whether this goes through or not. They earn a salary, whether investment comes in, whether jobs are created or not, doesn't seem to affect their bottom line and their own existence. And that's the frustration, and they don't always think like business. So some of the requirements are just not practical.
So Saki, we're almost 2 minutes towards the end of the show. And if you could put on the table the big things that you think should have already formed part of, or should form part of the pipeline of projects that we should see coming through that are going to increase the ease of doing business, reduce the cost of business, that are going to cut down red tape and are really going to see or facilitate investment into the province, what should we be expecting?
For me, Nozipho, I think the first big thing on the theme about partnerships is that business has to come to the party. I think we've seen around the world a lot of calls on let's be long-term focused. Let's not just look at short-term profits. So I think the business has to, in South Africa, we've seen big income inequalities and the noise that comes with it. So if there is going to be growth in the world, we've got to accept it means looking at things a little bit differently and have a long-term view that, yes, as a business, it's not my responsibility to create jobs, but if the country grows, we all grow, and it's beneficial for everybody. Otherwise, economies that are not growing are not good for anybody. So I think there's gonna be a lot more expected, not just from government, but from the private sector, to offer a lot more leadership on what commitments they can make to the country to help deal with the socio-economic problems. Because again, government on its own can never grow an economy, can never be the one that creates jobs. It's just one small portion of it. So for me, that's really the big thing. But there are certain specific things, as I said, we're doing. How can we influence government to spend responsibly in a manner that improves job creation in South Africa? How can it spend money in a manner that creates long-term certainty? How do we make things a little bit easier that you don't feel you've got to figure out which door to knock in to get things to be resolved? Not just business, but also ordinary citizens. Because again, if when I sit on a dinner table, Rui says, well, it takes forever for things to happen, I would rather actually go and immigrate and go elsewhere. That negativity does not attract people to come and invest, doesn't attract them to even come and be tourists in a country. So we do need South Africans to change the way we look at the country and the things that we do and be a lot more responsible on the investment. So creation of new markets is something we've got to do as government. We've got to be a lot more agile in the responses and do things a little bit. And that's a role we have as the GGDA, to be that bridge between government and the private sector and get things to move a lot more faster.
Well, a key theme that's come out of the conversation and has certainly been carried up to this point is long-term certainty will always form a strong bedrock for real and meaningful partnerships. And this way we may begin to identify new markets, new opportunities for businesses based in Gauteng. And that brings us to the end of today's discussion. Thank you so much to my guests. That's Jeff Nemeth, President and CEO of Ford Motor Company South Africa, Saki Zamxaka, CEO of the Gauteng Growth and Development Agency, Rui Marto, Executive for the South African Portugal Chamber of Commerce, and Keith Khoza, Spokesperson for the Gauteng Office of the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, as well as Human Settlements. Until next time, thank you for joining us. From myself, Nozipho, Mbanjwa, and the team, it's goodbye. Thank you very much, guys.